everyone. Welcome back here to the main stage. Hopefully you got a chance to tune in for our opening keynote and got a chance to walk away from your computer screen for a minute and are joining us back here again. I am really excited for our next conversation. This is the first panel of the day. We will have 3 of these. We do have another guest with us, which I'll mention here in a minute, and you're not going to be able to see his face for having some camera technical issues, but he will be here audio-wise. So this panel, we're calling it Our Human Nature. It's understanding why mis and disinformation spreads. We have some really spectacular folks here who are going to guide us through this conversation, including our awesome moderator and a friend of mine, Alex Witsey. Alex is a freelance science journalist as well as a correspondent for Nature magazine. I also know Alex because she serves as the president of the Rocky Mountain Association of Science Writers here. So I'm very excited to have Alex with us today, moderating our conversation. Our 3 panelists that we're going to cover a lot of ground with are Ziv Epstein. He is a PhD student in the Human Dynamics group at the MIT Media Lab. We also have Cary Funk joining us. She's the Director of Science and Society Research at Pew Research Center. And we have Stephan Lewandowsky, the professor at University of Bristol. And Lee actually made a couple of call-outs to you, Stephan, in the first panel if you didn't get a chance to join us. So Ziv's head is not here. You all may experience that, but he is here and he'll be part of the conversation. So I'm going to pass this over to Alex and say take it away. I look forward to hearing what you all say. Thank you for being here today.
Great. Thanks so much for the invitation, Kristen, and for what's been a great event so far. I think I got the invitation because I wrote a feature in Science News earlier this year about misinformation. It's in the resources section over on the side. There's a thing called Expo, and under Expo, there's a bunch of resources. So it's there for you to check out. It looks at some of the latest cognitive science research into why fake news lodges so easily in our minds and how hard it is and why it's so hard to dislodge it once it's there. So you've just heard, if you were here for the opening lecture from Lee McIntyre about disinformation and science denial, which I personally learned a lot from. I actually did not know the origin of the Bill Gates microchip theory. But we're here now to set the stage for the rest of the symposium to look at why misinformation and disinformation spread. Why is this happening? How is it unfolding? And what role does our human nature, in addition to the technology that we work with, play in the uptake of misinformation? Research has shown, as Lee talked about, there's a lot of deliberate disinformation being shared by bad actors, but there's also a lot of fake news being spread, especially on social media, by well-meaning people who just simply aren't paying enough attention. That suggests that our human nature plays a big role in this problem. It's not always troll farms in Macedonia. You and your social media diet are probably part of the problem. I know that I am, at least sometimes. So we're going to frame it in this panel by talking first about the scope of the problem, then about why it's such a problem, and finally about some of the solutions our panelists see going forward. You're going to hear a lot more about tactics to fight misinformation as the day goes on, but you don't want to miss what our panelists here have to say as well. So let's start out by taking a look at the landscape in which misinformation takes root. And Cary, because of your work with Pew, I wanted to ask you first to talk a little bit about how people make sense of information that they're encountering. How do ordinary Americans think about scientific information that they're consuming? And what do we know about how people try to make sense of complicated and sometimes contradictory information?
Sure. So I'm sure, hopefully most people know Pew Research Center. We do representative surveys of the American public as well as international surveys. So I'm going to try to channel what we're learning there. And what I do in particular is to oversee our research related to science and its implications for science, for society. What I want to just start with is from the perspective of scientists and public health officials, of medical scientists, the issues around misinformation, in particular related to COVID-19 and related to the COVID-19 vaccine, from that perspective, these are dire, really life and death consequences, right, of misinformation. So that's why there's so much heightened concern. When you think about it from another angle, from people sitting here in their living rooms, sitting around in everyday life, that experience is quite different. And I think one thing to keep in mind is how much we are dealing with massive amounts of new information. So yes, we've learned a lot more about science during this process, and people on average say that they have learned more. We've learned what an infectious disease is. That's a novel coronavirus. We've learned a lot more about the research and development process. We've learned a lot more about public health officials and what they do to try to stop the spread of diseases. But in that process, we've also heard a lot of information that has been developing over time, and we've heard lots of shifts in those guidelines. So, in particular, shifts over what you would do to spread to stop the spread of the disease, and even shifts over whether the goal is really about stopping the spread or whether it's reducing the harms of serious cases of COVID-19. So I want to keep all that in mind, because what we're seeing from center surveys is that people pick up on that mix of information and they have mixed views about it. I'd say we asked people whether or not they had different kinds of reactions to changing public health guidelines over the past year or so. A majority, I'd say around 6 in 10 Americans, said something that'll be reassuring to scientists, that they found that changing guidance reassuring because it shows that scientific knowledge is always being updated. That's in line with the idea that science is iterative and it's going to change over time. But at the same time, many of those same people also said it was confusing. And, similar shares, about half or more, said something pretty negative, that shifting guidelines actually made them question whether or not the information was true, or basically how much to follow the information. And for some people, it made them kind of question the transparency of public health guidelines. So that's, I think, the starting gambit of thinking about the land of information and misinformation from that public perspective.
Those are great points, Cary, especially about just the sheer volume of information and then the shifting nature of it, which, especially as we've seen, as you said, in COVID times, has made things so much more complicated. And just thinking about Omicron variant right now and the shifting nature of, hour by hour, what we're learning very much underscores that. Zibby, I wanted to move to you for a moment, and your little pulsating eye there on the screen. I wanted to talk a bit about sort of the platforms on which this information is being spread. We know that the architecture of platforms through which people receive information can affect kind of how they intake it. So how, and this is a very obvious question in some respects, but it's also really gets at, I think, the heart of the scope of the problem. I mean, how has the explosive growth of social media really affected the rise and spread of misinformation?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. That's a great question. And I must say, I apologize that you can't see my face. We're talking, this panel is all about challenges with digital technologies, and here webcams are a part of that. So, it's part of the thing. To your point, I think that, the architectures of these platforms are a deep part of this problem. We've seen unprecedented growths of these technologies in the last 10, 15 years. And with that has come very intentional decisions on how these platforms should be architected by systems designers for certain outcomes. And so what that oftentimes look like is you have newsfeed algorithms that are optimizing for engagement, getting people to kind of click and like and comment on things. You have platforms and interfaces designed to keep people dwelling on platforms, to click on ads and all these kind of things. And, when you're a platform, this can be a great thing to kind of, make a profit and get new users and all these kind of things. But I think what we're kind of seeing across the board is the kind of perverse incentives and externalities of these kind of design decisions. And when you kind of prioritize growth and engagement, it shouldn't come as a surprise that misinformation and things that are kind of provocative and potentially untrue might kind of spread kind of far and fast. And so what I would say is that, these design decisions kind of explicitly made by these kind of architects ultimately kind of may lead people to be distracted and may lead people to be foraging for information in an environment where there's real news, serious things going on with the world, interspersed with cats and dogs and recipes and your grandma's, new birthday. And in those kind of environments, you can kind of see how the problem might kind of naturally arise.
Great. And there's lots to be said about the role of platforms here, and we may or may not want to circle back to that a little bit later in the conversation. But just to say, with this scene setting nature for a moment here, I want to go to Stephan and ask if you can give us a sense of kind of the global scope of the problem. I mean, here in the US, as you know, we're familiar with misinformation about, COVID, politics, climate change, which are common themes globally. But when you look around the world, can you just sort of center kind of the American experience in the misinformation landscape more broadly?
Yeah, I think misinformation is a global problem because, as Siv just said, the platforms have a role to play in this, and Facebook is global, and so is Twitter. And so therefore, whatever information is circulating around the globe will sooner or later show up in other countries. For example, just yesterday, I came across a case where the German public TV broadcaster had to debunk a myth about COVID-19 vaccines that originated in Arizona a few days earlier. And, I was able to trace out how the misinformation traveled. And so, that happens all the time. And of course, it does have consequences. In the United Kingdom, for example, early on in the pandemic, there were all sorts of acts of vandalism against 5G broadband installations because of this conspiracy theory that was around for a while early on, that the virus somehow was caused by 5G broadband. Of course, it isn't, but that didn't stop people from burning down cell phone towers. So it is a global problem, and we have to deal with it, I think, globally, just to echo what Ziv was saying about the need to look at the algorithms the platforms are using to feed us information. But there's one other thing we also have to recognize, and that is that there's quite a bit of data from a number of different countries suggesting that what the pandemic has done is to actually increase trust in scientists, in the public, considerably. In Germany, for example, the proportion of people who trust scientists has tripled, or it did triple early on in 2020 in response to the pandemic. It's been sliding down a little, but even the last few months, the increase in trust compared to pre-pandemic levels is still very noticeable. And similar data exists for the UK, and I've also seen American data, although I'm less sure about that right now. So what we have to consider is that, the vast majority of people is actually, quite willing to engage with science, as Cary has already told us. But there is a very vocal and sizable, not small, it's sizable, minority of people who are completely resistant to scientific evidence in many circumstances.
Great. Let's stay on that point of trust for a bit, which I was going to circle to later, but it seems like a great time to finish that thought. And I want to ask Cary to weigh in because she and her team at Pew have done research on trust in institutions such as scientists, the military, and others. What has your research shown about how the let's sort of go back to the US, since that's what most of your data, I believe, is on. Correct me if I'm wrong, but what does it show about how the American public trust scientists as compared to other institutions, and how has that changed in the pandemic, as Stephan has set up here?
Sure. Yes, obviously we look a lot at public trust in science and scientists. Let's get to the short version, which is yes, Americans, their overall trust in scientists have gone up. The overarching measure we use is called kind of your confidence in scientists to act in the public interest. There's a but to that, which is that it hasn't gone up uniformly. So there is a kind of more politicized take on scientists and their work today than we saw before the coronavirus outbreak. So that trust has been rising pretty strongly among Democrats, but it's really flat or possibly going down among Republicans. In terms of global data, we do also have that global data, and there are also other organizations, in particular the Wellcome Trust. The Wellcome Global Monitor just came out this week, which has 113 countries from 2018 to early 2020. And so, there's going to be a lot of variation because actually, right, how this pandemic really showed us how important our globalized world is, but it also showed us how governments all took the advice of scientific advisors, but they often took different advice and they acted on different policies. So you're going to see some of that variation in the data as well. Just tell you one takeaway from an analysis between 2020 and 21 that the center did really showed how across most countries, actually, people's rating of the government's handling of the outbreak had gone down, but the strongest correlate is actually case counts in terms of deaths from COVID-19. So that really talks to how the outcome of these policies is important and how people are evaluating what the governments are doing and how governments and scientists are connected in terms of how people are seeing them.
Huh, that's fascinating. One project I worked on at Nature last year was a year-end piece where we got sort of on-the-ground stories from frontline advisors, scientific advisors to the government in many of the smaller countries that we don't always hear about, you know, Bolivia, Lithuania, and so on. And the uptake of scientific advice, you know, varied due to so many factors, depending on the context of each situation. Great. So we've set the scene here for a bit of how broad the scale is of this problem and how global it is. I'd like to move now to sort of talking about the reasons for this problem. So our charge here is to talk about our human nature and why misinformation is so easy to stick in our brains. And I think, well, let's go back to Stephan, who's worked, of course, a lot on this, has most famous, well, he's worked on a lot of things. The Debunking Handbook, if you haven't looked it up, is sort of your first stop for the most user-friendly, public-facing summary of all this. But I want to ask you about stickiness, Stephan. From a cognitive science perspective, what is it about fake news that causes it to lodge so deeply and insidiously in people's minds? Like what's going on in our brains that makes us vulnerable to information that may or may not be accurate?
Yeah, great question. And well, there are two things. The first thing is that generally people will believe what they hear or see. And that's for very good reason, because most often we should believe what we hear or see. If I ask somebody what time it is, they're unlikely to lie to me. If I ask my neighbors when I have to get my rubbish out or my trash out for collection, and they tell me it's a Tuesday, that's usually true. So, you know, we're actually conditioned to believe what we hear and see for very good reason. And the problem with that, though, of course, is that if something turns out to be false, then we have to unbelieve it. And to unbelieve something actually turns out to be cognitively very difficult. And we have a lot of research to suggest that even simple things like negations, if I tell you that John is not tall, you find that very hard to process, much harder than if I say John is short. And it's the simple act of negating, unbelieving, that is cognitively actually very complex. And in a situation where you're trying to understand the world and you're building a model of the world around you, if all of a sudden you discover that a key element of that model is false, then it's even more difficult to unbelieve that, because you would be left with an incoherent model of the world that has a hole in it. It's like pulling out the support from underneath a building. It leaves you in a weird state, a weird cognitive state. And so that is why misinformation is sticky before we even get to the politics and emotion and all that other stuff that also plays a role. But the fundamental cognition is very difficult. And one of the things that follows from what I've just said is that it is better to not just correct misinformation, but to also replace it at the same time with an alternative explanation. Because the moment you do that, people don't have that problem of having this mental model of the world that is incomplete all of a sudden. Then they just replace one element with another. And it turns out we have a lot of evidence to suggest that that is much more successful. So if you can explain to people why something is wrong and what it is that's correct instead, then you have a much better chance at correcting people. But it is a fundamental attribute of cognition that unbelieving things is surprisingly difficult.
Could you give an example of sort of replacing information, like in a, what give us an example of how you would do that in daily life?
Well, with the COVID-19, the 5G conspiracy theory, instead of just saying, oh, it's wrong, if you say that, oh, okay, well, not only is it wrong because then you can explain that a virus really has nothing to do with radio waves, but if you then furthermore explain that the reason people resort to conspiracy theories is because they feel anxious and they feel a loss of control. If you explain to them where the misinformation comes from, then that is all helping them to kind of say, oh, okay, there was somebody here who was trying to mislead me, and in reality, it's a virus that causes the COVID, and we know the virus. We have tests for it, we've identified it, we know everything, not everything, we know a lot of stuff about it. So that would be an example where you can shift people's views, unless, of course, they're totally committed, and that is yet another aspect of misinformation. Some people just, it's part of their identity and they believe it no matter what you tell them. But that's a slightly different issue, and that's a smaller segment of the population.
Okay. And just one more follow-up for you, Stephen, before we move on to Zivi. I just want to get back at that notion of how it makes sense for us as humans to believe what we're told or what we see, because otherwise it would just be impossible to navigate our daily lives thinking that everything that was bombarding us was incorrect or misleading. I guess from a sort of a research, cognitive science-y perspective, how does that develop? I mean, is this something like in infancy? I'm not sure the sharpness of the question, but like how early in our development does this happen in terms of our, needing to believe what we see?
Oh, very early on. And in fact, there's evidence that it takes quite some time for children to develop even the notion that somebody might be misleading them. The idea of deception is not something that we, naturally acquire when we're 2 years old. We're much older than that. I forget now exactly what age, but in primary school or something, it becomes possible then to tell children, do you think this guy was telling the truth, sort of? And they then understand the concept that something might be deceptive or misleading. But yeah, it's quite a sophisticated thing to acquire. I mean, we're pretty certain that primates, for example, chimpanzees, do not really have the notion of deception. There's a little bit of suggestion that they do, but not nearly as much as humans. And that alone tells us that it's actually a fairly sophisticated thing to deceive people and to then discover that and to fix that and update your mind. It's quite complex.
That's fascinating. I get along a little bit in years when I sort of think about trying to, learn stuff with my own brain and relearn things that I may have, been doing decades ago. That's kind of one of the biggest challenges, right? Not to think everything I always knew is correct is the way to keep going forward. I want to move to Zivi and ask a bit about the role of attention. So you've done research on the role of attention in people's intake of information and whether it's accurate or not. Are people actively looking to share misinformation, or does laziness or inattention play a big role in its spread? Tell us about the kind of work that you do in that area and what you're finding about people's motivations.
Absolutely. So what we find is that, surprisingly enough, people actually can be quite good at discerning truth from falsehood when prompted to do so. So, we have all of these kind of cognitive machinery and psychological intuitions about what is true and what is false, that when we take advantage of those, we actually can be very good at kind of determining, separating the truth from the falsehood. So I think really where rubber hits the road, though, is that oftentimes people aren't kind of using that capacity that they kind of have. And when you think about the kind of context of social media, where there's other potential kind of social motivations for sharing content, such as pleasing friends and followers or signaling group membership, then you might not be kind of thinking about accuracy, which then in turn means you might be thinking about these other kind of features of content that don't kind of align with veracity. So kind of with that kind of suggests that, inattention is playing a big kind of role in this. And people may just be kind of lazy due to just the environment they find themselves in. And, it's unclear, whether that's just kind of people being people, or kind of, as I mentioned before, like the platforms kind of having some more kind of intentional role in that. But ultimately, it seems that, we are an attention economy. And, in a context where we are commodifying attention, there's only so much that can go around. And it's a lot to ask people to go through the kind of troves of information that people are seeing and also bring to bear their capacity for discernment. So it's certainly an uphill battle for people trying to kind of get good information online.
Sure. Well, let me ask you to stay on that for a bit, Zivi, and go into sort of questions of solutions. So you've had several recent papers out recently with this concept of accuracy nudges, that if you just kind of can prod people to think a little bit that accuracy might be important, that has an impact on how they intake information and how they regard that information. Can you talk about the types of experiments that you and your colleagues have done on accuracy nudges? And what do you find when you poke people to be like, hey, maybe accuracy is important, think about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. So basically, like this idea that if attention is this kind of key feature in discernment online, then that kind of suggests something very natural, which is if we can get people to kind of think more about accuracy, kind of move the spotlight of attention away from those kind of social motivations for sharing and towards this construct of accuracy, then that should kind of kick in and get people to use this like awesome machinery for discernment that they have in the first place. So a large kind of chunk of our work has been thinking through what are these ways to kind of prompt people to kind of think more about accuracy in their sharing decisions. And a big way we do that is basically by asking them. We say, here's a piece of content. Is this accurate? Do you think this is real? And, when you see something like that, you kind of stop and think for a second and you go, does this line up? Do these premises kind of follow from these conclusions? All these kind of things. You're in that mindset of doing the work of thinking and reflecting. And what we find actually is when you prompt people to think about accuracy in that way, that actually spills over into the rest of their sharing decisions. Once they've been kind of put in that mindset, it kind of persists through the rest of their kind of session browsing in. So one kind of way that we do that is in these laboratory experiments, but also in field experiments on Twitter, where we actually engage with real people on platform, ask them about the content of things, how accurate they are, and see how that kind of affects their behavior. And I'll just say that I think things like this are very exciting as potential interventions, because a lot of ways of trying to reduce misinformation rely on centralized, machine learning algorithms that say what is false or what is true, and these kind of centralized arbiters of truth, which is a very kind of dangerous thing. But the key idea here is that if every person themselves has the ability to discern truth themselves, then you can rely on that. You don't need this kind of centralized truth. You let people decide for themselves. So in that way, it can kind of promote everyone's own autonomy and agency in making decisions for themselves without relying on these kind of centralized approaches that a lot of people have put forward for kind of tackling misinformation.
That's a very sort of democratic way to look at it, which I like. It's also sort of very optimistic and forward-looking, because as a journalist, I have a naturally cynical outlook on life, and I just think, oh my God, all this misinformation, how are we going to get through all this? But the notion of very, very small nudges to have effects sounds like a good thing to me. It looks like we had an audience question about directly prompting people to evaluate what they're hearing in order to help them separate truth from fiction. I think we've pretty much gone into that space there. But let me ask Stephan to talk about some of his research as well, because you've done a lot of, again, direct experimental work in trying to inoculate people against bad information. Can you talk about those interventions that you've done? How do you go about inoculating people against bad information? And how do you know when those inoculations have been effective?
Yeah, well, basically what we do is sort of similar to what Ziv is doing, except we take it a step further. We say, okay, in addition to alerting people to the possibility that they might be misled, we also got to give them the tools to discern information better. I mean, Ziv is right. People do, on average, do a pretty good job in judging truth, when they look at headlines. But we think we can push them a little further and give them better tools. So, for example, what we do in a series of experiments we've done, we present people with very brief videos. We've now got them down to only 30 seconds, and they're quite effective. And in those 30 seconds, we can teach people something about how they might be misled. For example, we tell people that misinformation and people who want to disinform you tend to be very emotive and emotional, and they seek to provoke outrage. And one of the reasons, of course, they do that is because when people get emotional and outraged, they stay longer on the platform. So the platform algorithms are actually selecting low quality information for us because of the payoff for advertisers. Now, once people have watched that video, if we then present them with test items that are, designed to test this new skill, then they become much better at discerning poor information from higher quality information. And we do that again without interfering with there's no censorship. There's simply coaching of an ability that people can then apply to any information they encounter. And we now even have data to suggest that that is fairly long lasting. We're talking about, a week to 10 days easily. And we're now looking at the possibility of having these little booster shots along the way every so often to remind people of their new skills. But there's quite a bit of evidence now that inoculation makes people more resistant to misinformation. One other thing I want to add to this, again, because I think it's very important, that can't be the solution or the full solution to the problem. The problem isn't just that we have to, dump it all on people and say, hey, you have to be better at it. No, we have a systemic issue. We have a structural issue. And the design of the platforms, the attention economy that Ziv has mentioned, the algorithms that I keep mentioning, they contribute to the problem in a very strong way. We now know, for example, that Facebook's algorithm is favoring anger 5 times more than positive emotions in ranking the information that shows up in people's news feeds. And guess what? It makes people angry because they're constantly exposed to angry information because of that algorithm. And I'm questioning whether that is healthy for society to do that. I question whether it's healthy for algorithms to favor polarization, to favor outrage, to favor anger. Really? Do we want that? I think probably not. And I think the problem is that we've arrived at an architecture online that has evolved without anybody knowing where it was going over the last 10 years. And the technology has just developed so fast that we're now confronted with something we never actually designed. And in a democracy, we probably don't even want. And that is, to me, a very important battle that we have to fight, a political battle to see what we really want from the internet.
It seems like there's a very much of a scale disconnect here in these questions. I mean, there's sort of individual choices that we make as consumers in terms of, what apps we use, how closely we follow them, what we post, repost, retweet, whatever. And then on the other scale is sort of the national, international geopolitics at play, the business interest of enormous companies. So, I mean, how do we sort of go about reconciling like our individual acts as consumers every day when there are just giant forces, right? Sort of trying to push us in various directions. I'll open this to whoever wants to take that.
Well, I'm not going to answer your question, Alex, but I am going to just take it back to the purpose here to talk about human nature and, whether or not we have the tools through social media to share information on those platforms. These are all fundamental issues. We still would be sharing information. We would still more than likely be overloaded by information, and we would still be making cognitive shortcuts, sometimes attending to information, sometimes not. So these are challenges that are going to be with us. They are kind of amplified because of the ability to share information so quickly across the whole world. But they are fundamental problems that would be with us regardless of how society chooses to weigh in on what's happening there.
Can I reply to that or connect to that? Is that all right? Because, I mean, you're absolutely right. And you mentioned that it's so much easier now to share things. Yes, and the flip side of that is that if you make it harder, it can actually have interesting consequences. And I'm thinking now of one rather tragic set of events that occurred in India a few years ago when there were mob lynchings that were effectively caused by misinformation being shared on WhatsApp. And it's a long and complicated story, but basically, you know, several dozen people got killed in this through mobs that were incited by misinformation. Now, what WhatsApp did eventually, when they got to the bottom of this problem, was to introduce tiny changes. Number one, they limited the number of chats to which you could forward a message down to 5, I think, whereas previously it was unlimited. And they identified a forwarded message as being forwarded rather than as originating seemingly with your friend. So they identified shared information more clearly. And they did a third thing, which at the moment I forget. But basically, these were tiny architectural changes. And, you know, it's hard to know whether that really solved the problem, but we certainly know that these mob killings stopped once these changes were made. And if you look at other evidence about introducing friction, making things just a little bit harder, for example, Facebook did it earlier in the pandemic, that they overlaid false information with an opaque mask that said, hey, this is fact checkers tell us this is false. Now, they still allow people to click through if they really wanted to. But that mask, that warning, was enough to cut access by 95%, according to their own experiments. So, yes, there is a fundamental human thing at play, but we can still design the affordances for that. We can design a system that is exploiting our weaknesses, or we can design a system that is protecting us against our own weaknesses. And we do this all the time with, you know, pension plans, encouraging people to save for the future, with mandating, you know, health insurance, this, that, and the other, where, you know, the society is built on safeguarding us against our own weaknesses. And there's no reason we can't do that online.
And just to build on that, if I may, thinking about too, like kind of how those interventions might be kind of rolled out, like, you know, as Cary said, this is a human problem. It's been around forever. Misinformation is not new, you know, since the days of yellow journalism back in the day. Like, this is not a new thing. People have always been kind of struggling to figure out what is true. And ultimately, there's a lot of really good kind of contextual clues and cues that people use to figure that out. And a big problem, as Stephan just said, is that there aren't a lot of good cues on the internet today, with this goal of making everything frictionless and streamless and kind of clean and clear. All those kind of cues that people might use to kind of understand stuff kind of falls away. And so really thinking about what are the kind of things that our psychology, our cognition is designed to look at to arrive at good conclusions, to kind of use the best of human nature and encode those into the design of our surfaces, to kind of bring out the best of the real world into the digital world. I think that's this like exciting way to bridge not only kind of individual level action, but these kind of broader kind of geopolitical things as well.
That notion of intentional design is a really great point, and well taken there, Zivi. We have some reader questions coming in, and just a reminder, if you have questions for the panelists, to drop them into the Q&A or the chat function. Ziv, I want to ask you about, there's a question here about accuracy nudging and kind of a development on that. The question from Tom Heister is, we've heard about accuracy nudging, coaching people to be better at discerning information, but it seems that once positions become part of identity, it's more difficult. Is there a concept of identity nudging, maybe helping people expand rather than narrow their identity space?
That's a really good question. So certainly I agree that if you kind of take this attentional account of misinformation to its logical conclusion, this means that getting people to think more and kind of be more deliberative will kind of be successful in kind of reducing the misinformation that they share. If, however, thinking more is kind of entrenched in ideology, if you have, you know, there's these kind of groups of people who actually have maybe misinformation beliefs from the get-go, thinking more isn't going to help you there. And so ultimately, there is these kind of bounds of where this is helpful is this kind of clickbaity thing where inattention and just kind of a lack of thought is the problem. The kind of these questions of ideology and polarization, I think, are much deeper. And, there has been some kind of evidence of kind of exposing people to kind of counter-attitudinal beliefs on social media. I think that one particular day actually showed a backfire effect where people actually weren't very happy seeing things across the aisle that made them kind of even more upset. But, thinking about how we can create more diversity of content online and kind of move people's Overton's window, if not kind of, globally, but at least locally, kind of helping them to kind of think a little bit outside their own echo chamber. I think that's this huge space of possibility that I think we're just really getting started to understand. And yeah, I'd be super curious what other people think about that as well.
Yeah, Cary and Stephan, it seems like both of you must have thoughts about identity nudging.
Yeah, let me just say a couple of things. I mean, one is that I think we should think a little bit beyond identity too, in that the kinds of misinformation that are most concerning tend to be things that really connect with people's values. Sometimes values line up with ideology, but sometimes they don't. And why? Because people care about more than the facts, right? They care about the emotional reaction, the value implications of information. And so that's where we need to be thinking about how does this misinformation take hold, and it tends to be those kinds of things. I think my go-to example on that is the misinformation around fertility concerns from coronavirus vaccines. Why does that have so much power? Why did it stick around for so long? It's connecting with something people deeply care about, and so it's very concerning. And it sticks around. So I would want to think a little bit about these kinds of possibilities beyond the idea that everything's an expression of identity.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, there's a lot more than identity, but the other factors you identified, like values, are in a sense, from our perspective, equally problematic because they make it very difficult for people to change their minds and to be receptive to evidence. Now, this is a tough one, of course, and one of the reasons it's difficult is because we don't have very good online spaces at the moment where you can have a productive conversation that might deal with your values and identities, whatever it is. However, if you do it in real life, quote unquote, in a physical context, there is quite a bit of evidence now that deliberative assemblies and mini publics where people are chosen at random and they're put together in a room together with a moderator, a skilled moderator, they can actually do amazing things and bridge, seemingly unbridgeable divides, at least to the point where the conflict doesn't escalate. And the examples that I can think of is the Republic of Ireland, where they had two referenda recently, over the past few years, one on abortion and one on gay marriage. Now, I can't think of two issues that are too much hotter than that in terms of polarization, potential polarization. And yet they were able to do that without polarizing society too much. And the way it worked, or the reason they were able to do that, is because they took 100 citizens, put them literally into a hotel room or whatever, a ballroom, for 1 weekend a month for a whole year, and they deliberated the issues. And with the help of experts and thousands of submissions from the public and the whole, but because it was a random selection of citizens, they were, everybody in the country felt represented in that room by somebody. And so when they issued their recommendations at the end, which were not telling people what to do, but which outlined all the sort of major factors they considered and what they concluded when looking at these issues, when they issued those recommendations at the end, there's research showing that the public overwhelmingly thought these were good faith efforts, and they agreed with the process. And then people voted on it, and the issue was basically resolved. And we have similar examples at local community levels all over Europe, and indeed also in some US states. Oregon comes to mind, where they have a similar mechanism in place ahead of referenda. So we do have ways of structuring discourse to overcome a lot of these seemingly these incredible barriers, but we haven't found a way yet. Well, we don't know enough about a way yet to do it online. There are some pilot tests out there. There are some platforms that are being used in Europe to enable this, but I don't think we're confident enough yet to know exactly what they should look like.
So that distinction between online communities and not online communities leads, I think, really nicely into a reader question we have from Amy. And I'm going to want to toss this to Cary first to take a stab at. Amy says, there's many people I know who don't access social media. They're not on Facebook, Twitter, but they're still picking up misinformation through their social bubbles. How do we work within those situations where social bonds are more important than assessing the accuracy of that information?
I think it's a great point to just reinforce that information is going around beyond social media, whether social media is part of the way we share information, but it's not the only way. And I think to that point, one thing that really comes up a lot, and I just will use vaccine hesitancy as a good example of this. It exists well before the coronavirus came to us. And it also exists in many different forms. And I think that's what this question is reminding me of, is that there's many different kinds of or reasons people are hesitant about taking a vaccine, whether it's coronavirus or Ebola or measles, mumps, rubella, something else. And so some people are hesitant about that particular vaccine. Some people think all vaccines are kind of suspect and they're worried about what's going on in their body. That's what we need to do when we're talking with people, is trying to get at what are the sources of their concern so that you can kind of address that. I think I'm losing a little bit of the thread, but you got to get to these communities and figure out what's going on in terms of their level of concern so you can address that. It's not going to be about basically shoving facts at people, right? You need to be addressing what their value concerns are, their emotional concerns are. So, and doing it with respect for their perspectives, not kind of shunning them for having a different perspective than you.
Yeah, no, I think that very much gets at Amy's question. So that's the same approach, whether you are, interacting on Facebook, with Uncle Steve, or if you're at church talking to, your sister-in-law on some particular day. Ziv or Stephen, do either of you want to weigh in on this question of, are there different approaches when you're trying to combat misinformation in platforms that are not social media, online?
Well, if it's okay, then one other thing I want to point out, and this is one of the problems with doing anything online. The social cues that you're getting online are necessarily potentially distorted. And let me tell you why. If you were the proverbial village idiot in the 19th century in some remote village in Gloucestershire or wherever, and you thought the earth was flat, then no one else around you would have believed it. Would have believed that. You would have never met another person in your life who shared your belief. And we know that the strength with which people hold a belief is determined by how many others share it. If I'm the only one who believes something, I'm not going to believe it that strongly. However, if I have 100 others, then I'm going to be convinced of it. And now imagine going to Facebook and saying the earth is flat. Well, guess what? You're going to find 1,000 others who believe that. Now, you would never meet them in real life because they're just a tiny number of the billions of people on Facebook, and they're spread all over the country, all over the world. So you all of a sudden have this appearance of many people sharing your belief, even though you would never meet anybody like that in real life. And that social cue that you get online has consequences because it entrenches your beliefs. It makes you resistant to correction if you're surrounded by an epistemic community. And so one of the big problems with going online is that we completely lose the conventional social cues that we've had for hundreds of years, which is just getting a sense of how many others in my neighborhood believe things. And that is what makes it so difficult to kind of, you know, get the social cues right, so people know when they're exposed to an opinion online that actually no one else is sharing that. Makes it much easier to dismiss. That's one of the architectural things we got to address online, and it's very difficult to do.
Just to build on that a little bit, I think that the kind of structures that you're talking about there also kind of plays into the kind of cognitive biases we have. Like, you know, for example, we have like an availability bias. We kind of look at what is kind of in front of our face to kind of look at what is representative of the world. And if you see lots of extreme beliefs online, you might think that that is kind of the distribution of those beliefs in the world. So there's this thing where we look to the world around us to figure out what other people think. And when there are these kind of selection forces, whether that's finding people who have similar kind of niche beliefs as you, or that's just the kind of mediation of these algorithmic systems, either way, it has these distortions on the kind of way that we forage for information in the first place. And I think that idea too of just going back to those 100 people in a room, you know, this, you know, the Dunbar's number, right? The small number of people coming together, really kind of relying on these intuitions, and where that kind of cognitive machinery, those, you know, those biases, quote unquote, were honed to kind of do certain things really well and not other things not so well. So thinking about what are the contexts and environments where we can really kind of get that kind of deliberation to work. Certainly these kind of large scale broadcast based social media platforms are places where it doesn't seem to work as well.
And can I just make one more segue, because of course this is one of the roles that public opinion surveys play, which is they can show you the extent to which your views are shared widely or not. And of course, for many of us, you know, our assumption is that, well, I guess other people must think like myself, right? And so it's really only these representative surveys that give you that sense of it. On the other hand, of course, it's not always easy to hear that your view is not widely shared. So so that's kind of one of the purposes of the tool, I think, is to help us understand other people.
Great, thanks for that. We have quite a philosophical question coming in from Roger that has to do with sort of individual responsibility and collective survival. I don't quite know who to direct this to, so I'm going to open it up to whoever wants to be philosophical today. Roger's question is, if humans are largely social animals valuing affiliation with groups and their influence, can emphasizing individual responsibility and sharing the value of that for survival as a group be successful in creating more critical thinking? In other words, can we play on people's individual responsibility as a way to sort of promote group survival? Who wants that one?
Well, one thing that just comes immediately to mind, this is kind of a free association, but you know, this whole idea of kind of using social cues and popularity as a cue for the performance of things. So basically kind of using some kind of simple newsfeed algorithm to kind of rate things based on popularity. If you have individual, there's these kind of theorems that say that if you do this at the individual level, if everyone is just kind of locally foraging for information and using social signals to do so, at the collective level, that actually corresponds to quote unquote Bayesian rationality. So at a collective level, that actually is kind of the most efficient way for society to kind of process information, allowing every individual to kind of use their local context to kind of forward and advance collective intelligence. So I think there are these kind of like more mathematical interpretations of this question, where if everyone is kind of using the brain they've got and the information in front of them to kind of do their best, that individual behavior can correspond to something at the collective level that is like actually very exciting and compelling, kind of leans into the promises of these technologies. I think just kind of making sure it kind of works the best for individuals is a part of kind of realizing those larger goals.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are mathematical theorems in that, like, you know, Condorcet's jury theorem, that if you put people together and they're independently coming to a decision, and if each person is just a tiny bit better than chance, then in the aggregate, the decision is guaranteed to be the right one in mathematical terms. But there's one caveat to all this, and that is that the signal or the exposure in the local neighborhood must not be gamed. The moment you're being manipulated, then of course all of that is rapidly distorting and becomes increasingly problematic. So, but yes, I agree. There are a lot of ways in which people are very good at aggregating information. Just look at Wikipedia as one example. That works phenomenally well. And one of the reasons it does, I think, is because it's moderated. It's not a free for all. It is much harder to game than let's say Twitter, where you can just get an army of bots to go out and do a pylon and create an appearance of an opinion that isn't actually widely spread in society. Now, back to the philosophical question, the sort of idea between individual responsibility and the common good. I mean, yes, that's of course, the tragedy of the commons has been with us for hundreds of years. If people pursue their own self-interest, then they're gobbling up everything and there's nothing left for the community as a whole. That risk is always there. But equally, people are actually, if you put them in a situation where they have to kind of allocate resources, depending on circumstances, very often groups of people are actually quite okay with preserving resources and for this not to collapse into this dystopian free-for-all where everybody is just out for their own good. People can negotiate, and they do. And so I'm not totally pessimistic about that. But again, it depends on the architecture and the situation in which people are put, and whether there are sanctions for people who overstep the bounds, for example. That's very important. But we do know that there are ways in which we can cooperate. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't have societies. We would just Mad Max world out there, and we're not yet.
Not yet. It feels like it's sometimes, maybe not yet. Thank you both for tackling that philosophical question. Cary, did you want to dip into anything, or should we go to the closing questions here? Okay. Actually, I'll go to you first, Cary, with the closing questions. So I just wanted each of you to say, we've got just 3 minutes left here in the session, for your top tip for someone, your average, ordinary Denver Museum of Nature and Science lover who's in the panel today, who wants to take away actionable tip. So what one thing do you recommend to your average person that they should keep in mind about how they consume news and information? So Cary.
I just would draw from what we know again and again from public opinion that people's beliefs are rooted in their values and emotions, and information is a small part of it if you're thinking about information as facts. And so what science communication kind of folks that are on the ground every day talk about again and again is listening with empathy. So it's when you encounter people who have different views, it's trying to hear their perspectives, their concerns. You can share why you have a different judgment, but you want to recognize their concerns in that process, not trying to talk at them, but talk with them.
Thank you. Zivi, your top tips.
Yeah, so I think in this kind of like freemium economy, like if you're not paying for the product, you are the product, and in these kind of environments that we find ourselves in, we have an enormous a situation that we find ourselves in and how we browse these situations. And so to be a citizen in this world is a big responsibility, to engage in civic discourse, to understand things, and to show up for platforms and engage in ways that kind of are pro-social and move the ball forward. And so I think there's a lot of things in this world that kind of make things easy and commodified and seamless and passive. And in this time more than ever, we really need to be responsible citizens, responsible consumers of information, and really kind of think about what our values are, how we want to engage in these things. And yeah, as Cary said, have empathy and be open to kind of new opportunities. It might not be hard, but it's the way forward.
Great. Thank you. Stephan.
Well, there's so much to say. I think, don't mistake your Twitter feed for reality. I think there's something very different about the sampling that you get online from what you'll actually find out if you talk to your neighbors. And I think one of the problems is that we have to resume actually looking at physical people next to us rather than relying on strangers online.
I personally will take that very much to heart. Don't take your Twitter feed for reality. I mean, most of the universe, most ordinary people, most human beings are not on Twitter. And it's easy, especially as a journalist covering news, to get caught up in that echo chamber. So thank you for that reminder. I want to thank our panelists. You guys have been fantastic, Cary, Ziv, and Stephen, today. Thank you for your time. I'm going to punt it back to Kristen.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Cary, Stephen, Zibby. That was an awesome conversation. And I was laughing back here because I came on smiling because my husband says to me when we have these conversations, he's like, just stop using it. You know what I mean? Like, it's a choice. You know, it's much harder to you know, that's said in a little jest, but, you know, I appreciated that advice. Just stop using it. Thank you all so much for today. This has been a great conversation, really set us up for, as we're going to just kind of keep unpacking throughout the day. Quick reminder to everyone, join us back here in 15 minutes. We're going to have another short break. We're going to jump into the impacts on science and authority, including a lot talking about data, the media landscape. We're talking a little bit about politics. We're getting down into the weeds even more as we go. So join us back here in 15 minutes. If you want, check out, we've got a poll, I think, here on the main stage, some poll questions coming up. Again, reminder, you know, you're welcome to chat individually, privately, and connect with people. There's some great reading sources in the expo hall. We'll kind of keep building that out as more things come available and people suggest things throughout the day. But yeah, we'll see you back here in about 15 minutes. Thank you all.
Thanks.